Let's move on and talk about this story. Russia finds itself at odds with the UK and the US after both countries begin to lean towards the possibility that a bomb took down that Russian airliner over Egypt. The Kremlin and officials in Cairo are warning against jumping to conclusions until the investigation is complete. But both American and UK intelligence officials have reason to consider it might have been a bomb, possibly planted by ISIS, that killed all 224 people on board. British Prime Minister David Cameron, speaking today, defended his decision to restrict British flights to the Sinai Peninsula.
We've had some excellent discussions today, not only about what Egypt has done in the past to increase its own security and the security of tourists, but also the further steps that can be taken today that will help to make sure that our British citizens can return home after their holidays in Sharm. To answer your questions very directly, you asked whether we're the only country taking action. Actually, the United States had changed its travel advice, and there are some other European countries taking some similar action to what we've done. But my role is to act in the right way to keep British citizens safe and secure and to put their security first. Now, I act on the basis of intelligence that I receive. I act on the basis of advice that I get. Of course, I cannot be sure, my experts cannot be sure that it was a terrorist bomb that brought down that Russian plane. But if the intelligence is, and the judgment is, that that is a more likely than not outcome, then I think it's right to act in the way that I did.
Let's get straight to CBS News senior national security analyst Juan Zarate. He joins us now on the phone. Juan, Prime Minister Cameron says the evidence is more likely than not pointing towards terrorists planting an explosive device on that Russian jet. Why is Russia so quick to dismiss the terror claims? And also, why is the United States, as you just heard from Josh Earnest, not adding anything new to what's already been discussed?
Well, Vlad, I think this is all about interpretation of existing data and extrapolating and analyzing what this potentially means. And I think what you've seen from the British government is a fairly aggressive posture as to how they're interpreting the data. I think everyone is now circling around the reality that there was an explosion on the aircraft. The question now is what caused the explosion. That, of course, could be mechanical failure or other triggers that are not terrorist-related. And, of course, there could be a terrorist bomb that was the cause of this, the proximate cause. And so I think what you have is different interpretations of what we have in the data and a different set of willingness to jump to certain analytic conclusions. And the British are being very cautious, as you heard from the Prime Minister, being very cautious about their citizen safety, travel in and out of Sharm el-Sheikh. A lot of British citizens take holiday there, and so I think he's being cautious. The Russians, on the other hand, understand the consequences of what this means if, in fact, ISIS was able to perpetrate this attack on a civilian aircraft in response to Russian activity in Syria. And certainly the Egyptians understand that if this was a terrorist attack, that it's going to not only chill the tourism industry, but that it represents a new phase of the battle that they have with ISIS and militancy in the Sinai.
Yeah, so Juan, what it sounds like is that there are certain political considerations that these leaders take into account when deciding whether or not to divulge what their investigations have led them to conclude. In other words, Russia and Egypt have one agenda, the United States has another, and Britain has another. The question, though, I have is I guess a lot of people would expect Russia and Egypt to be in one camp, the UK and the US in another. Is there any kind of intelligence? I'm sure there is, but what kind of intelligence sharing is happening, especially amongst the United States and Britain, do you think?
Well, the most intimate information-sharing relationship is between the U.S. and the U.K. There is a very close relationship within the intelligence community, certainly law enforcement, and obviously at the political level. And so the U.S. and the U.K. tend to work hand-in-hand on intelligence matters. And certainly on something like this, there's going to be a robust amount of information sharing. At this point, I think this is a matter of interpretation. And we're talking about degrees of data and analysis and how far each country is willing to go in its interpretation as to how much evidence is enough to declare that this was caused by a bomb. And I think the U.S. is being cautious because the U.S., I think the intelligence community and the political class wants to ensure that we have enough data to be able to make that assertion definitively, because the consequences of that conclusion are pretty dramatic. As you and I have talked about, Vlad, over the last 48 hours, this is a potential game changer if, in fact, ISIS was able to perpetrate this kind of attack out of their affiliate in the Sinai, attacking a Russian civilian aircraft. And so everyone wants to be very cautious about the conclusions that they draw because the consequences are so severe.
Yeah, and those consequences, Juan, given that a lot of analysts are calling this, if this turns out to be a terrorist act, they're calling it one of the most significant terrorist acts since 9/11. For those of us in the West who have seen the activities of ISIS perpetrated primarily against other Arabs, other Muslims in the Middle East, the attack, the severe attack, not including the beheadings that we've seen of journalists and AIDS workers, this significant attack, 224 people killed if it turns out that ISIS planted a bomb on this plane. How does the landscape change? You talk about it being a game changer. How does the landscape change?
Well, quite dramatically. In the first instance, as you allude to, it demonstrates that the fight against ISIS is no longer contained just to Iraq and Syria or to particular local targets, that this is a group that very much has in mind hitting outside powers, Western powers, Russia, directly with terrorist attacks. And so in many ways it opens up the battlefield to make it a more regional and global battle space. And you now have to worry about what ISIS is perpetrating through its affiliates throughout the world. And they're popping up on every beachhead and every safe haven you can imagine, from Libya to the Sinai to Central Asia to the Middle East. And so that begins to change the scope of how we think about the threat. In addition, I think it does huge damage to what had become a comforting narrative among some officials in the West that ISIS was really just about creating territory and space in the heart of the Middle East, that they didn't have that al-Qaeda global jihadi DNA embedded in them. Well, this does real damage to that narrative. In fact, it describes and manifests quite clearly that that may not be the case. Now, we don't know yet for sure, but if in fact this was ISIS, it demonstrates that they have more of a global reach than we had anticipated, and certainly more global ambitions for conflict than people have expected.
Yeah, Juan, and as we've been saying, given that they've killed thousands of Muslims, they've killed Christians as well, there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or a reason other than their idea that they want to establish a caliphate. But I also wondered if I could play devil's advocate for just a moment, and this global reach that they have, clearly because they've attacked a Western airliner, but I also wonder if because that flight was originating in perhaps an airport, in a part of the world where perhaps the security measures are not as stringent as they might be, for example, at John F. Kennedy International Airport here in New York or at Heathrow Airport in the United Kingdom, if that sort of plays into it as well. Perhaps we're ascribing a greater global reach to them than they deserve?
No, you're right, and I think one of the cautionary notes for all of us is to make sure we don't think of ISIS as 15-foot giants or the shadows around every corner. And I think that's absolutely right, and that's a good instinct. On the other hand, if you're in the intelligence community or the counterterrorism world, in many ways you have to assume the worst. And when we've assumed that we've contained the problem or that we've imagined the worst of problems, whether it was al-Qaeda in the 1990s or the reemergence of ISIS, we've consistently been surprised at the adaptations and the reach of these groups. And so what I'm suggesting is that if, in fact, the group in the Sinai that's affiliated with ISIS, which has not been really seen as a major central threat to the West, if that suddenly demonstrates that they can be a platform to hitting the West, even if it's just from Sharm el-Sheikh, it does raise the specter that perhaps ISIS in places like Libya or ISIS emerging in pockets in Europe or ISIS in Afghanistan may begin to take on a more global mantle and decide to begin to attack Western interests, whether they're embassies, whether they're aircraft, or even trying to get operatives into the homeland. And that's where the counterterrorism dimension of this changes if, in fact, this turns out to have been an ISIS plot.
Yeah, Juan, and that point is well taken. Certainly, perhaps a lot of people thought in the first World Trade Center bombing, then subsequently to that, the Tanzania and Kenya embassy bombings, and then the USS Cole in 2000, these were just pinpricks, and we found out ultimately that they were not. Brilliant analysis as always, my friend. Thank you so much, Juan Zarate. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Vlad.